major life function. So if you think about 1/3 of the total population of the United States is in some way disabled, the idea of disability becomes a little bit hard to nail down. So just because a student has a disability doesn't necessarily mean that they qualify for special education services. And so that's hard for parents to understand, because they might have a student who has a diagnosis, and that may play a part into special education, but just because you have a diagnosis doesn't mean you get special education. So you have to have a disability. They have that one piece. Then they have to have some sort of educational impact. And then once we combine those two together, we go, okay, well, what would we do? What kind of specially designed instruction would we provide that will help that student improve? And if all three of those prongs are met, we say they're eligible. We call that the three-prong test of eligibility. Does that make sense? Okay. And again, it's important to remember that just because a student has a diagnosis doesn't mean that they get special education. So we have lots of students who have autism or are diagnosed with autism, but they've adapted and functioned very well and don't need any sort of specially designed instruction that we can provide that would improve that.
Is the 504 plan under the umbrella of special education?
Okay. No, it's under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay, so how does it work? How does a kid get special education? Well, first, it starts with a student is referred to special education. The school team looks at that referral. Either it comes from one of the school personnel, it might come from a parent, it might come from an outside service provider. The school team looks and sees, is there a need? Is there an educational impact that might lead us to think that we need to do an evaluation? If we agree, then we initiate a comprehensive evaluation, and we look at all areas. On an initial evaluation, we're actually required to look at all 13 categories. Some of those we can kind of kick out right away, right? Like, so if we have a student who's being referred for reading, we can kick out like deaf, blind, right? Or visually impaired, because we know that they're not that. But we are required to look at all of those categories upon initial evaluation. Once we've done the comprehensive evaluation, we look at the categories, we determine, is a student eligible, yes or no? If the answer is no, then the student doesn't receive special education, but they could receive an accommodation, right, like 504. So if you go back to that three-prong test, if they have a disability, they have some sort of educational impact, we might be able to provide an accommodation in the form of a 504 plan, and that might help them. So that would be what would happen if the answer is no. If the answer is yes, then the team writes us an IEP. The team determines, based on that IEP, what services, location, all this stuff together. They determine placement, and then those services are delivered. Then the team reviews the IEP, and then we write a new one, okay? That process right there happens annually. Actually, not annually. Every 364 days is what we're required to do. The larger process of eligibility, we're required to determine whether a student is eligible every 3 years.
So can I just ask,
Yeah.
student is referred, is this anybody, like a parent can refer them, a teacher? How do they get referred?
Yeah, anybody who has a stake with the student can. So it can be an outside service provider, a doctor can do it. Even a bus driver can if they felt like they needed to. Okay. But we do have a very streamlined system. We have our student support teams in our schools who are continually looking at student data to determine, do students rise up? We do have parents who make referrals on a regular basis.
Is this also, because I know we have some of those kiddos that are like behavior issues that could stem from a special ed. What's the process? Are you going to talk about that later?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right.
Because and it's very similar. I mean, actually, we look in special education, legally, we're required to look at all things as skill-based, right? So whether it's reading, whether it's math, whether it's behavior, we have to look at it as if it's a skill that we have to teach, right? And so the process is very similar. We do interventions. Ultimately, what it comes down to is we have to make sure that we're not referring a student to special education because they simply belong to a special class, right? So just because you're disabled, we can't say, oh, Bryce, you get to go to special education because you have some sort of disability. The same thing goes with behavioral disorders. We can't just automatically make them special education because they have some sort of behavioral disorder. Not specifically, but we will.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so when it comes to the categories, you can see this is how our students are broke out in Granite School District. We have our last average daily membership from last school year, we had 62,000 students, give or take. Our largest group of students fell into specific learning disabilities, so think about our learning disabled kids. They were the largest group. Next were other health impaired. And you can see we've got emotional disturbance, 3%, multiply disabled, about 3% as well. Our smallest group would be our deaf-blind kids who are both visually impaired and hearing impaired.
Is that because they generally go to the Utah schools for the deaf and blind?
Yeah, it is.
And what are the examples of the specific learning disabilities that I
So
should have
those
in
would
my
be
mind?
our kiddos who receive services for reading or just math. So for whatever reasoning, their cognitive processing is a little bit slower in a specific domain or specific area. So they just struggle with reading. They might have everything else doing just fine, but they're slow readers, they're slow comprehenders. They might have a processing disorder where they're not quite connecting. Think about our dyslexic kids with dyslexia or dysgraphia. Ultimately, we service about 13% of all the students in Granite School District have some sort of disabling condition and are receiving special education. That's a total of 8,136 kids at our last count. Okay, so let's talk about LRE. That's a question that we get quite a bit, and I'm sure you guys hear.
I just want to take a minute on that 13% because, I mean, that's really 1 in 6 kids at our schools,
Yep.
you know, that have and often it feels like special ed is kind of like sidebarred, you know, in the world of education. I don't mean necessarily in our district, but when you really put it in a perspective that it's 1 in 6 kids, it's actually pretty mainstream. You know, that's like, that means that everything going on with that group of kids, they need to be considered in every decision we make, really.
Ultimately, and there's a lot of, and because we're viewed oftentimes, not necessarily in Granite School District, but often because special education and disability in general is viewed as othered, it's not taken into account what can be done so like take technology, since we just talked about technology. There are lots of ways that now we can integrate technology. So these kiddos who might have needed some profound, a very intrusive accommodation in years past can very easily access assessments now because we have screen readers. It's built into the software. They don't have to, have some sort of extra device. And it's also freed up a lot of our resources because a lot of those things are built into devices now. So for example, an iPad now costs me a couple of $100s, where before, when we had kids with severe disabilities that they needed to have a device that talked for them, we would have to purchase what was called a Dynavox. They're about $8,000. So in a lot of ways that's helped out quite a bit as well. So when we talk about LRE, which is, again, least restrictive environment, there was a bill that went through the legislature last year requiring students be taught in the LRE, which is already a requirement by 34 CFR by the IDEA. But what LRE refers to is not necessarily a place or a location, but it's a principle that a student is, to the maximum extent appropriate, educated in an environment that is on par or similar to their typically developing peers. So it can be in the same classroom, it can be in the same building, it can be with the same curriculum, it can be with the same teachers. There's lots of things that go into LRE. But the deceiving part about that is that word environment, because it feels like a location. And because technically our services have to be along kind of that spectrum, that continuum that we talked about, but pragmatically we can't do that. We have to put kids into classrooms, we have to have a teacher and those kinds of things. We end up creating these artificial boxes, and that also leads into this false idea that LRE is a location, right? So we have special classes, so we think that a special class is an LRE in and of itself, which it is not, if that makes sense. The purpose of LRE is to make sure that students with disabilities are included to the maximum extent possible with their peers. The IDEA doesn't spell out any particulars for any disability category or any specific disability in and of itself. So just because a student, say, has a behavioral disorder doesn't mean that they're going to be in one of our social emotional learning classrooms. They can be maintained in lots of different places. And that's hard for a lot of folks, especially when a person is very into having, order. I want this to be placed right here, into this little box. It becomes very easy to say, well, this is a student who has emotional disturbance. They need to be in an SEL classroom. So the question becomes, well, how do we know if a student's receiving their services in the LRE? And it's actually a process. It's a cycle. And what that process looks like is, first we determine what the FAPE is. We write the IEP, we have goals, the services, that's the what. We first determine that. Then we determine what the placement is. Where is that going to be? Who's going to provide it? And what kind of curriculum do they need? Then we provide that FAPE. We look at it, we monitor it, we take data. And then we go back and examine how did that student do? The integrated experience of delivering that FAPE. Did the student make progress? Did they not make progress? Do we need to change anything in that? And when we do change that, did the student improve? It's this whole process that we go through to determine whether a student's receiving LRE. So when we have students or individuals who we feel like or suspect might need to be in a more restrictive placement, or we move into a more restrictive special class, we have to go through this process and we have to collect data. Now, the IDEA and case law and precedent has established that we don't get to just look at a certain student and look at certain symptoms and say, oh, you smell like you need to be in this kind of a classroom. We actually have to show that we've done interventions and that student is either having success or not having success, therefore justifying a movement to a more restrictive placement. The assumption is always that a student will be with their peers to the maximum extent appropriate.
So we always get this question, and when I try to explain an LRE and everything, they say, well, how come we have Hartvigs and that's, how come
that, right?
Yes.
That has to do a lot with what is that word appropriate, right? So a lot of our students who are at Hartvigs, they receive no benefit from interaction with their peers, either because we consider them to be custodial because the nature of their disabling condition is so severe that we need to isolate them from the general population because of health issues, right? We have Hartvigs and we have Whittier where we put our severely health impaired kiddos because they need to have a nurse and those kinds of things. They might, their behavior, typically at Hartvigs we don't just have behavior, we have severe impairment and we have behavior, right? And so part of that also has to do with safety of others as well, right? So there's a lot of factors that go into why a student might be placed in a special school. We have several of them, not just Hartvigs, but that all has to do with how well and how reasonably do they actually access all those other things that are in a general kind of population school. Did I answer your question?
You explained it much better than I could ever explain it, so I appreciate you explaining it.
So for your information, we have, this is the continuum of educational placements that we have here in Granite School District. We have everything from regular class all the way over to institutions and hospitals. So let me show you what that actually looks like in practicality. So we have regular class, that's just gen ed. Think about it as all kids, right, in Granite School District. Then we have regular class with part-time special education services, and that's actually split into three groups. We have students who receive less than 40% of their day receiving special education services, between 41 and 79% of their day, and then more than 80% of their day. The more than 80% of their day, that would be what we consider to be self-contained. Then we have our special classes, and we throw around these acronyms, and you probably hear them all the time. FK, DK, those are our functional or diagnostic kindergarten classes. Those are half day and they're in special locations around the district. We have applied academics. So those students are self-contained, but we would consider them more like a self-contained resource kid. So they're still receiving core academics, but they are not necessarily as integrated into the general population, just because the nature of kind of the services we have to provide doesn't allow us to have them in a general classroom. Then we have our functional academics classes. So those are kiddos who are pretty severely impaired, but they still have the ability to learn some reading, some math, those kinds of things. We have functional life skills. Those would be our more severely impaired, maybe even custodial students. We have our social emotional learning classrooms. So you can think of these as what we used to call behavior units. We have our child behavioral therapy unit. Those are for our emotionally disturbed students who are more severe than our typical SEL placement. Then we have our special schools. We have Hartwigson, we have Granite Connection, Granite Peaks. We have AIM, or Adolescents in Motion. We have our Granite Alternative Placement Program. We have our YES program as well. All of these are special schools. We have Hartwigson is exclusively special education, but then we have special education services in all of these. AIM is a program that we do, is a day treatment program we do with Valley Mental Health for our kiddos who are too severe for us to even maintain in a school building. Then we have home instruction. So we actually send teachers into some students' home. A lot of times these students, you could consider them to be in palliative care or kind of in end-of-life situations. We have hospital or institution. These are students who are, they might have had an accident, they might have had a surgery or something like that, and we're just trying to maintain their education. Or institution in the case that we have a student who is in like a day treatment program that's privately placed, then we also offer services to them as well. Some other issues that are important for you to know about that we're currently working on in special education and that you're probably going to hear about. You know, we've got this push for universal all-day kindergarten. That's something that we're working through right now because that will throw a huge wrench into the way we manage our system. Having our FK and DK classrooms as kind of half day, 2 sessions a day. Once we go to all-day kindergarten, I'm required to provide that same service, which means I'm going to have to double the number of kindergarten classrooms and sessions that I have, which will require an addition of about 18 classrooms for us. So that's something that we're trying to figure out, and hopefully the legislature is going to give us enough time that we can figure out how to do that.
And so when the legislature is looking at all-day kindergarten, they are not looking at the special ed implications of that.
Oh, they're not looking at how it implements.
And how to fund that.
No.
Yeah.
They should, absolutely they should, but they're not looking at how that's going to affect
Okay.
that with us.
That was with an exclamation point back there.
We also have this social push for students to get closer to their homes. One of the things that's important for you to know is for the last 20 years, the push has been more specialized, more specialized, more specialized services. So as we get more specialized, in order for us to stay fiscally responsible, we have to locate all those kids together in one location, which means we have to transport them, right? Which ultimately means we have fewer kids that we have to bring together, which means those kids get further from their homes. But you can't have super specialized and right close to your homes, because ultimately, a lot of times those folks are also our 1% students. If you think about, 1% of the students in Granite School Districts, that's only 600 kids. It's very hard for us to maintain that with a licensed teacher with 1 or 2 kids in a building, right? So now the push is for students to get closer to their homes. So that means we're going to have to dismantle this system that we've built for the last 20 years of having super specialized units and going to something less specialized in order to get those kids closer to their homes, if that's where we're going.
Do you feel like as we do that, because I know it's been a hot topic, because we're not going to be able to specialize, they're not going to get the best education possible for them? Or are we still like, will they still be able to maintain what we're doing?
So I would actually say from my own personal belief, they'd actually be getting a better education because it would require that they are more integrated into their home schools. So some of the things that we've had, like, we just went through a budget cut where I ended up removing adapted PE because that was a thing that our special classes, they all only had PE by themselves. That is one of the easiest ways for a student with severe disabilities to be integrated into their grade level peers, is with something that's low expectation like that. But what had happened is we had created a system where even that they were pulled out of. So these students aren't integrated into our schools the way we should integrate them. So with the specialized training, maybe we're going to sacrifice a little bit of that specialized training, but the benefit, I feel, outweighs any sacrifice that would be made that way.
No, I know there were some PE teachers that were, what's a nice way to say it? They were, they were hesitant about doing that because they didn't feel like they had the training for it.
Right.
How are we overcoming that part of it? Because
so those kids aren't, the fear was that they were just dumped into PE, and that's not what happened. Those kiddos were sent with paras and aides, or a classroom teacher went in with them. And they weren't, the whole class wasn't sent in. It was usually one student or two students with a para in second grade or third grade with their grade level peers. So it wasn't nearly as impactful.
so are the teachers, are you hearing, have the PE teachers been okay with it as
The
we've done
PE
that?
teachers have been. The classroom teachers have been less okay with it. That has a lot more to do with that's how we've always done it than having a real.
Has
hard
that
time with
taken
it.
away any of their planning time or anything because they've had to go into PE with them, or is that not affected planning time? I don't know.
Well,
if
they've
you're the one
allowed it
asking.
to, a lot of folks have allowed it to. And that has to do with the fact that, like, when you're in a special class, you don't necessarily operate in the same type of schedule, and you get to organize your time in a lot more cohesive way. So it's up to you to organize your time. A lot of those teachers also didn't, even though they were given planning time, because those students were pulled out during adaptive PE, didn't use their planning time because they were pulling kids for interventions and doing things like that during that time. So it's been less impactful. The teachers who embrace the idea of integration into and mainstreaming in their classes have had very little impact.
Can you just clarify for me, when you say social push for students, is that, so it's not a legislated push, it's,
So
what do you
it's
mean
a
by
little
social push?
Last year, 2 years ago, there was a big to-do in Jordan School District where they had, in two different high schools, they had like special classes, like what we consider to be an FA class, a functional academics class, with 2 kids in it. And it just wasn't a good use of their resources. So those kids lived a mile from the other 2 high schools, so they closed those units and tried to move the kids to nearby high schools to maximize their resources. And the community went into an uproar over that because they wanted those kids in their home schools. So there is kind of that societal push. There also is this push for, as I mentioned before, this bill that went through the legislature last year requiring LRE. It's the same group who's pushing the legislature that way, but we are expecting there to be a lot more legislation that's going to be pushing us towards this as well.
Thank you.
So I have a question. I was talking with a mother of a child who is in a special ed, autistic more, but he's high functioning. She was frustrated because she wanted him to go into a regular classroom, certain classrooms. I said, I don't know how you do it, and so what's recommended when a parent is requesting and a teacher said, okay, it would be, I would do what I could to help, but it wasn't happening, so I don't know
So
if it was.
one of the frustrations that parents experience is that once a student receives or is eligible for special education, and a parent has granted permission for the school to provide special education, in some ways, they lose some autonomy because now the education of that child becomes a team decision. It's not a unilateral decision. I mean, the parent has ultimate say in that they can revoke services, right? But ultimately, we have to look, now a team gets together and the team has different expertise and they look at how that student is doing, how the student is progressing in school. And just like Nicole was talking about, when we move them to a more restrictive placement, what are the impacts of that? So if we remove this student into a general education classroom, are they going to, is it going to be, if you weigh it, is it more beneficial or less beneficial? Are they going to receive more benefit from being with their peers that kind of outweighs the good they would have from specially designed instruction and vice versa?
Okay, so then do I say, talk to the team?
Yep, they go back to the IEP team.
Oh.
And the last major issue we're working through is, I'm sure you've all heard, we have a little bit of a staffing crisis. Yeah, it's both credentialed and classified. So right now we have 17 openings in special education classrooms in Granite School District that don't have certified teachers. And we have about, at my last count, 162 para openings that are going unfilled right now. And we've done everything from offering retention stipends and bonuses to attract people. We're looking at increasing pay and things like that we can get to. Ultimately, however, the pie is as big as the pie is. And we only have so much money. However, because of our ongoing staffing issues, we have come in under budget last year, and that's allowed for some carryover that we're kind of just throwing money at whatever we can to see if that helps. Because right now, our major issue is personnel. We don't have, we're short on SLPs, we're short on school psychologists, we're short on teachers and paraeducators by far. Do you have any other questions for me?
On that staffing and funding issue, I'm not sure if other board members know, and Terry and I went to the USBA and Rich to talk about what our legislative priorities would be. All districts were talking about the difficulty of having special education not adequately funded. And the decision was made there that we would create a proposal that we could give next year to the legislature, giving incremental changes that they could make in order to eventually get us to funding, which is what we've done as school board members with the busing issue. We're going to take the same approach that we've done there because that was successful. So there will be a think tank of people who will get together to try to look at how we can actually fully fund this, because you can see this is a great local example of how we are not funded adequately.
Absolutely. And ultimately, so special education funding is very stable. The problem is it doesn't increase at the same rate as the WPU, because my funding is split kind of a 60-40 between state funds, which fund 60% of special education, and 40% which are federal funds. Federal funds hardly ever, well, they decreased under the Trump administration. And so it's hard for us to keep up, when it comes to funding when the WPU goes up, but that's only 60% of what I get. I have to absorb everything. So as we go, the funding crisis in special education continues to get worse because, yes, it does increase, but it doesn't increase at the rates of inflation or the rates of pay that we're giving teachers and everything like that.
Bryce, how do you determine the FTE for special ed?
So what we do is we take, the state gives me typically in about February, we'll get a list of what our federal funds will be, what our state funds are anticipated to be. Then we take all of the FTE we had from the previous year. I have my accountant who runs the numbers to find out what the costs are on that, to fund it at that level. We look at the average FTE rate, so how much does it cost me to have FTE? We pull out our paraeducators and kind of set that money over to the side, and we say, okay, so this is the pot we have for our teachers. And this is our average pay for teachers. So the money that's coming in, this is what it cost me last year. Am I going to be able to maintain that for this coming year? Then we kind of divide up the pie that way to see how many we actually have available. Ultimately, once we take into account, COLA increases and salary increases and stuff like that, we're not necessarily able to keep up with what we've typically had in the past. So essentially, if you think about it as a pie, right, the slices just keep getting, the pie itself, the slices stay the same, but the pie just continues to dwindle down smaller and smaller. So we have to, cut where we can, whether it's resources, materials, because ultimately, sometimes we've had to run into the hole in Granite School District. We did that during COVID because some of our funding dried up. We do get federal funds from Medicaid reimbursement, and once we went all online, none of those are reimbursable services. So we lost about $3 million of funding there, and we had to use one-time funds to make up for it.
So aside from what Julie is saying, what needs to happen? What do we need to be aware of as a board? Is this really a federal issue that we need to?
So yeah, I mean, it is a federal issue. The IDEA, when it was originally written, was designed to be funded at 40% of what it costs. It's only funded at 17%. So there's a federal funding issue there. Our legislature is on a push right now to unrestrict our special education funds. They actually want to give anybody and everybody access to those funds. Right now, they're only allowed to be used for the access costs of educating students with disabilities. They want to be able to give districts and boards access unfettered to that money so they can do with it whatever they want, whether they want to pay gen ed teachers and paras out of it, whether they want to build buildings or whatever. So that's a push they've got right now that we need to kind of safeguard. And one of the best things you could do is with USBA, push a priority of building a fence around those restricted funds, because that, not that we would ever think the Granite Board would ever do that, but we've got unscrupulous boards that do that. I mean, we have one charter school in close proximity that's currently having to repay about $3 million worth of funds because they did exactly that.
Do you feel like that's why this is coming through as a push, because of that example? Because that's what I was thinking, was the charter school.
Absolutely it is. In fact, one of the representatives of the charter school and the attorney for that particular charter school is actually the author of the bill that came up and that was passed. I worked with some other special education directors 2 years ago to defeat the bill. It came back this year, and they changed it enough to nullify it, but they got that LRE language in there, which allows them to keep pushing that same envelope. So we're anticipating they're going to keep pushing on it.
Can I just ask kind of, I had somebody bring this up, and I said I would ask. So when a child gets diagnosed with something, I guess, because this goes back to my question, and at the beginning when you said anybody can refer them for whatever the issue is. If it is something, what is it that you have to have a diagnosis for? Because, like, for example, dyslexia, do you have to have a diagnosis there in order for that to happen, or what?
No. So when we think about our 13 categories, the only ones that actually require a diagnosis are other health impairment, because you have to have some sort of diagnosed health issue, traumatic brain injury. You obviously have to be diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury. Autism doesn't necessarily require a diagnosis as much as a medical history, and how they're different, we're still not sure. Multiply disabled, you have to have multiple diagnosed conditions to participate. But other than that, behavior disorder, you don't actually have to have a diagnosis to be classified as being emotionally disturbed. Orthopedic impairment, you have to have a diagnosis for. Visual impairment, you don't. Hearing impairment, you don't. Deaf blind, you don't need one for. So typically it would be kind of those more restrictive
I guess
classifications.
I'm asking more like like dyslexia or, and I know because my daughter has ADHD, so she's on a 504 with that. But, when we were going through this whole process, it was kind of okay, how do I help her get those accommodations that she needs? But I had to go through the whole process of getting her tested, and it took 6 months just to get her into primary children's, and it was over a year before we got her an official diagnosis to be able to take it to the school and say, okay, we need an accommodation for her because of her ADHD. And I think there's parents out there who are frustrated. How do we get this, even if it is a 504 and not an IEP? How do we get that? How do we get the services for these kids faster? How do we get them qualified for this?
So we're required, once a referral is made, we have to actually, upon initial evaluation, we have to make a determination within 45 school days.
So if a parent is saying, I think my kid has dyslexia, and they refer, they can go and say, can you guys, we feel like this is something that is an issue, and you guys will take care of it that way? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying,
Okay.
but Doug has.
I was just going to say, there's no need for the official diagnosis. That's the whole point.
Right.
Is that the school teams are trained to do their own testing. They test based, and they either they either identify as a student as having one of the 13 disabilities, or that the student does have a disability based on 504 criteria, and therefore needs certain accommodations. Neither of those processes require an official diagnosis from a doctor. I think that's what parents often misconstrue, right?
Exactly.
And indeed, we have an affirmative obligation under what's called child find to actually determine if our students, what's that?
To seek out any student with a disability.
To seek out any student with a disability. So it should not be this onerous process for parents. Now, clearly, students have to be qualified, and they have to go through the qualification process. But that process of getting them into the assessments should not be an onerous process for parents.
But it can be for a lot of different reasons. Either it's misconceptions or the experience that families have at home are different than the experiences that the student is having in the school, right? So what the school sees and what the parent sees are very different. And so there's disagreement there and pushback.
So how are we educating, I guess, maybe that's the component. How are we educating our parents to say, hey, if there's an issue that you feel like your student is, for this example, for this dyslexia, she just was frustrated because she said, I didn't know that we had services for this. And my kid has dyslexia and went for several years without any services. And finally, somebody else in the district said, oh, well, this paraeducator, I don't know if it's a paraeducator or a special ed teacher that travels around to the elementary schools, finally came down and gave him some services. And it was amazing. But she said, why did it take that long? Or what, so what is the process? How do we get this to parents so they understand this?
So we actually do run regular parent training. We partner with the Utah Parent Center to provide that training. We do it virtually and in person. So once a month we actually have training. It's usually over in D102, 106, 104. And we talk through a lot of these different issues with them. The question is, how do we get parents to engage with us? That's probably a bigger question that I'd let Ben answer and solve. But it's kind of that same issue, is getting that information out.
But you did bring up previously the student support process. The student support process is kind of the process in the schools where if a parent brings a concern to the school should immediately then fill out what we call a pink form to initiate our school support process, and that should be an automatic process.
It should.
Yeah.
Yeah, but sometimes that's complicated a little bit because when students aren't obviously disabled or it's not obviously impacting their education, that's where it becomes problematic, right? When we say they're riding the line, right? They're kind of like, ooh, well, they're struggling, but they're not really, really struggling, and they're having some success and not having great success. So what do we do with that student?
So can I just ask when this started? Of course, my children are older, but I had my son tested, one of my sons, and he performed low. He tested low, and they said, oh, you just have a dumb student. So I'm just wondering.
We don't say that anymore.
That's like, this is wonderful. When did it start about, what year?
Well, I mean, it really started, I mean, with Brown v. Board back in the 50s, but it really was in the 1970s. We had some landmark cases. In 1972, there were about 27 different cases that went to the Supreme Court regarding individuals with disabilities. That's what led to the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which eventually became the IDEA.
How long did it take for schools to get up, with that?
So 1979 was the very first year that it was required for all schools to deliver special education services, but that doesn't mean it looked like what it looks like now. Right? So we had, in 1982, we had the Raleigh case, which really said that, that established kind of the ground floor of what kind of services we need to provide. We just had a case in 2017, the Andrew F. case, which actually upped the benchmark for what we provide as a quality special education kind of service delivery pattern. So, I mean, it's ever evolving. And Doug can speak to this. I mean, the body of case law regarding, I mean, special education is one of the hottest litigated education topics in the nation. And so it's ever growing and ever changing, and it's kind of it's a moving target is what it is.
In the, study I've done of special education, the meager study I've done, one of the things that's always brought up is demographics and making sure that, certain demographics aren't overrepresented. And I just wonder if we have plans in place to make sure that we're really watching that. And part of that question also for me is, like I just did the math, if I have a school of 350 kids, then what did I decide? 45 kids in that school, on average, would be in special ed. But I know of several schools that are 350 kids who have a half-time special ed teacher. And so if you can kind of speak to all of that at the same time.
So you're really talking about prevalence rates, and prevalence rates really ebb and flow throughout our communities. So we tend to see higher prevalence rates where we have communities who have kind of lower socioeconomic status for a number of reasons. Some of it's nutrition, some of it's drug use, those kinds of things. Also access to outside services. So our higher SES locations have a lower prevalence rate, not necessarily because they actually have fewer students with disabilities, but their families are able to provide other services which kind of make up for it. So we tend to see, if we split our district east-west, our east side tends to have a much lower prevalence rate than our west side. That being said, that doesn't mean that there are fewer students with disabilities. It just means there are fewer students who have, because of a number of different reasons, have their education is impacted to a lesser degree.
So it means that of those three things, that one about the educational, I don't remember what
impact,
you called it.
yeah.
The educational impact is less because they've got other supports coming in, is that right?
That's right. So either, I mean, we see it with families who have professional parents. They tend to do a lot of those things that we know are pro-social, that insulate students, give them additional skills in school, whether that's sitting and reading with them in the evening, whether that's providing nutritious meals, whether that's providing structured schedules at home. Those kinds of things benefit students, and students adapt a lot better in educational environments when they have those provided in the home. And that can result in a student not necessarily not having a disability, but presenting in a school in a much different way and lessening the impact on their education.
And I've also seen lots of data that shows that an inordinate amount of boys are put into or identified as special education, as well as Black kids and Native American kids, and what was the other demographic? But, I think it's really important that we are making sure that we have like protections in place to make sure that we are aware and watching. And so do we have anything
Yes,
like
we
that?
do. So we actually have, so there are 18 different indicators that the federal government has identified as kind of mileposts that we're monitored on by the state every year. Indicator 13 is whether we're disproportionate in any subgroup. So the state actually comes in, we provide data every single year to the state. The state then comes back and sends us data that says, okay, this is what your prevalence rate is within each subcategory. And then in the event that we have a disproportionate number of students. So for example, we did receive a letter this past year saying that we were disproportionately identifying white boys as having speech and language impairments. So we had to go back, pull files, look at how those students were identified to determine that yes or no, they were actually identified appropriately or not. And ultimately, in that audit this past year, the state found that we were identifying them correctly.
I'm thinking of your chart that flowed through to where an IEP is eventually written. And I'm curious if you can clarify, if I missed this, I apologize. Can you clarify for me where the 504 plan comes into play in relation to that?
If we're going back to all sorts of, that one right there, right?
Yep.
So if you look over here where it says, a student is eligible to determined by the team, if the answer is no, the student doesn't receive special education services, that would trigger, as Doug was talking about, child find, where we go, okay, well, the student, obviously something happened that made us think that they had some sort of disabling condition that may require specially designed instruction. The team can go back and look and see, okay, so they might have a disability, they might have an educational impact, we might not have anything that we can teach the student, but if we provide an accommodation, which would be a 504, that student might actually, perform better. And that would be right where that happens.
I see. Thank you.
Yep.
Bryce, I wonder if you can speak a little more to what our philosophy is on inclusion, whereas some people say, no, all students should be included in the classroom, and many parents will even go so far as to say, no, I don't want my child in a special classroom or a unit. What I want is a one-on-one paraeducator, one-on-one teacher, and that's what's best for them. That's the best, least restrictive learning environment. Right? So can you just comment on how we as a district look at that and how we have been handling that?
Yeah, so we as a district, we believe in full inclusion, meaning to the maximum extent possible, we want a student to interact with their peers, be in classes with their peers, but we want them to also be on track to the maximum extent possible with graduation. So graduation is our ultimate goal. We want all students to get there. We do have, like I said, about 600 kids who graduation in the typical sense is not really an option, right? And these are the kids that you're talking about right there.
These are the ones who end up at post-high?
Yeah, they'd be the ones who eventually end up in post-high, yeah. Those kiddos. Those students, we want them to be, and they are in and of themselves not a monolith either, right? That we have kiddos there who go from custodial in a wheelchair with one-on-one nursing services to kids who, if you were to talk to them initially, you would probably think they were typically developing, right? But they just can't do math, they can't handle money, they can't do time, they can't do those kinds of things. And they're all kind of along the spectrum. We want them included to the maximum extent possible. We believe in Granite School District that even the most severely disabled student participating with their peers has benefit, if nothing else, for their peers, right? If we think about our commitment to building kind students, thoughtful students, students who see value in one another. That's one of those things that we value highly. Now, we have to balance that, however, with what is a student capable of learning. So a paraeducator is a far cry from a certified teacher, right? So we have parents who would be very happy to have their student in a class with a paraeducator. That paraeducator has neither the skills nor the education or the ability to gear and specially design instruction, you know, in every single aspect, every single minute of a day to support that student. So we have to look and see, is including Bryce, who has a severe disability, in a classroom, what's most appropriate for Bryce? Is he going to get benefit? Or if we pulled him out and put him in a smaller group with kids who are learning similar things, can we push him academically? And then the question becomes, how much time do we pull him out for that and put him back in? So we support full inclusion. That's part of the reason why we're trying to push right now to get kids closer to their homes and despecialize a little bit, is because we want kids more in their homes. We don't like having 3, 4, 5 units in one school and then schools with 0 units, because they have kids who should be in that school that are not. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually have 2 more questions, but I'm sorry I'm dominated the conversation. It feels like our parents of special ed kids are always just exhausted from doing an extra amount of advocacy, you know. I do feel like, especially in a moment where we are kind of bare bones as a special ed department, serving the student is the #1 priority. But we know that also when we help support their parents, that helps the student. So do we have any things in place for parents?
Yeah, so we partner with the Utah Parent Center. In fact, we have one of their advocates whose office is just up on the other side of the wall from Leslie's. And she's here full-time to support parents. She goes out with them to IEP meetings. They call and speak at, she answers their questions.
So she's the parent advocate.
She's a parent. She's a parent of a student who's attending Granger High School right now. She's not a school district employee. She's an employee of the Utah Parent Center that she's dedicated just to Granite School District.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm. And her name is Jennifer Oliphant. She is fantastic. She's great to hear them out. Sometimes parents just need to be heard. Sometimes they need questions answered. Sometimes they need support in a meeting, and she fills all those roles. And if she can't, she reaches out to the Utah Parent Center, and they'll send one of their other advocates out as well.
She also sits on a couple of committees in the district and provides that
That parent perspective.
And I feel like you sort of got at this with Nicole's question about PE and the teachers there. How do we support teachers who are interested in inclusion and welcoming those special ed kids into their classroom? But I mean, they add a challenge to the class.
They do add a challenge to the class, and it also requires that we do things a little bit differently. And that's a challenge in and of itself, right? It requires that we change our perspective a little bit about what is the purpose for what we're doing in certain activities. It also requires that teachers, we can't look at a student as a kind of an individual in a box, right? Just because a student is in a special class doesn't mean that they're not capable of doing things. So we want them to participate to the maximum extent possible. We do offer training to our teachers. Our special ed teachers also have training that they offer on a frequent basis to our gen ed teachers. I know I've worked quite a bit with GEA as well to support those teachers as well, whether it's meeting, hearing them out, or if it's actually talking them through a process and how to advocate for themselves. Right now, that's a big piece of it.
A lack of parents.
Paras.
Oh, paras. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
He's like, what? What's lack of parents? I had 2 more questions. Oh, really? Well, you keep making me think of more, I guess. Do we have the leniency, like, I'm not sure what kind of control we as a board have of the special ed funding. I mean, do we have the power to change how that is structured?
Not necessarily, because it's restricted funds, the state has identified in the legislature, well, the legislature has directed USBE to create structures and kind of boxes around what the funds can be spent on. So you as a board have very little control over what can and cannot be spent, money can and cannot be spent on.
So we couldn't create a different incentive plan or something like that?
You could, as long as it fit within kind of that box,
Could
right?
you do that without board approval?
I could, yes.
Okay,
And
I'm
working
just
on that
trying to
right
figure
now.
out where
Yeah.
it all
So one of the
lands.
things that I'm working on right now is how do we pay our folks more? How do we recruit and retain certain classifications of teachers, like our special class teachers? Those are the ones that are hardest to fill and to keep. So how do we pay them differentially for the amount of work and things that they do? So no, that's not something that requires board approval.
And that also does not require negotiations with the teachers' unions?
That might.
Okay. This will be the last official question. So about 2 weeks ago, I was in a behavior unit, being a substitute teacher, and we had combined 2 classes so that I was really just a helper and the other teacher was running the show.
Right.
There were 14 kids and 8 adults in the room, and I really was blown away by what happened that day in that class. They were all people who were, I would consider, experts. They were working their darndest. They were smart. They were amazing. And I would say that 20 minutes of academic learning took place in that day in that class. And when I left, the question I had is, how do we know if we're doing well?
That is, if we look from day to day, are our interruptions and things getting fewer over time? That's what we're really looking at. And also, we also look at the goals of certain students, right? So some of our students, to be honest, our goal with them is to tolerate being in a building and having some sort of structure. That's our goal. And if we can get them there, then we can start pushing, a little more academics, a little more learning, and those kinds of things. But you hit on exactly why it's so hard to keep and maintain some of our folks. Some of these students are so significantly impaired that working with them is exhausting. And then when you are paired up with, staffing shortages and you're doing it on your own, you're not seeing the growth that we might see in another situation. And that's why folks are leaving.
So I understand how to look at it individually per child and look at growth, and especially to have that IEP review every 364 days. How do we as a department and as a district know if we are doing well?
So we are required to create what's called a system improvement plan every year. And so we look at specific indicators at graduation rates, we look at student proficiency rates, we look at how many ESI or emergency safety interventions we have, how many minutes are we putting kids in either restraint or in seclusionary timeout. All those are indicators that we look at to see, as a department or as Granite School District, are we improving and are things getting better? Are they staying the same? Or are we going down a hole we don't want to go down? When it comes to individual classrooms, we look over time at are we, and it's really no different than a gen ed situation. Are our students learning skills? Are they actually, are the disruptions in class getting fewer over time? Or are we constantly having blow-ups and stuff like that? And we look at frequency, intensity, duration. How frequently are we having disruptions or issues? How intense are those and how long do they last? Because sometimes we have fewer disruptions or behavioral outbursts, but they might be super big and super intense, but they might be shorter over time. But they feel worse because we're not tracking and looking at the data in a meaningful way.
And do safe school violations fall under special ed?
No, they don't. Well, if they have an IEP, they do, but no, that falls under prevention student placement.
Okay. Cut myself off.
So, Bryce, one of the reasons why we actually did also ask this is because we know that we are looking at some schools that are closing, and one of those schools specifically has a unit, and those parents have expressed some concern. Can you speak to just how you determine where those units are, maybe have you guys looked at that as part of the PAC, where you're determining and how you determine that?
Yep, so we, as a PAC, we're meeting tomorrow as well. Yeah, we've looked at and proposed a couple of different placements for those students. So those students, those teachers, those resources, curriculum materials, everything, that is a district program located at a school. It's not necessarily a school program, right? And so all of those resources will move to where the new units will be located from Twin Peaks to whichever school. We're looking at a couple of different options. Here at Wilson, we're looking at possibly moving to Crestview, but on top of that, we've got some transportation issues that we have to consider as well, getting them there on time, and so we have to look at that. We also have to look at our constituents and how well they'll accept the move to different locations as well, because what we can't have is moving to a location, we making a determination that this location is where we're going to go, but then have all the parents refuse to go there, right, and try and put their students somewhere else. So that has to be taken into consideration. So we are looking at a couple of different options. Right now, we've got 3 different schools that we've identified as wanting or possible places that we could move those units. What we're looking for is locations that are closer to kids' homes, because right now, actually, Twin Peaks, when you look at the students where they draw from kind of the northeast side of the district, and they pull all the way down to Twin Peaks, which is almost at the complete southern end of the district. That's quite a ways to transport kids. And that means they're on a bus for a significant amount of time just to get there. When we could move it to somewhere more centralized, which would give all the kids a shorter bus ride, right? Which will also impact them a little bit less, because ultimately, when it comes to student behavior, time on a bus is a huge factor in that. So we're looking at a lot of different things, from location, time on a bus, services, how many classrooms are actually available in the different buildings, and where those classrooms are located. Because what we don't want is we're not going to put kids in a special class out in a portable away. We're not going to ostracize those kids either.
So this kind of along those same lines, as we move them from school to school, some of these units get moved just depending on where they are located and where that needs to be to be central. Do those kids, this is a concern that has been brought up multiple times, those kids, their testing scores get, even though they're from different parts, do they get counted in their home school, or do they get counted at that school? And what's that impact on that school?
So when a student becomes part of a district program in one location, they actually become a student of that location. We do dual enroll them just so we know where they're at, but their testing scores, everything falls under that location.
So how do we mitigate it? Because there's parents that are concerned about this as we get a program. Well, we don't want this program here because that's going to pull our test scores down and it's going to reflect poorly on this school.
Really, when you look at the grants, when we're getting schools of 500 kids, which is what we're pushing for, right? When we have a unit of 12 kids, 12 kids performing moderately to low is not as impactful in our experience as what it feels like it would be.
Okay.
Right? Because 12 kids is not, statistically significant.
Or is that where we're at? Or are there any that have multiple units, so there's more than just those 12 kids?
Whittier. So Whittier is one, that they're a medical hub. Right now, Truman has 3 classes, which is pretty large. We've added a couple of special classes. Actually, we haven't added. We've split classes because of the large numbers in a couple of schools. So they have 4 teachers with the intention of next year of moving those and creating units elsewhere to actually distribute that.
Okay. So is that per, I just don't know, is that per state law that we report them at that location?
It's not, but also keep in mind that our students who are severely impaired, they actually take the alternative assessment, and they don't count towards those same proficiency rates as our kids who are standard administration.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you
Yep.
for that clarification. Are there any further comments, questions? Did we cover everything?
Come on, you didn't give me any really hard ones. Give me a real hard one.
Go for it, Julie.
No, that was the aim. It was like, stop the jump.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate, I think this has been good for all of us to hear. And really, now we understand and how we can maybe help you as well. So we
Absolutely. And
appreciate
if you have any further questions, just let me know.
Thank you.
I'm
And
more than willing to clarify.
And thank you, pass this on. I have a deep appreciation for special education teachers. They do an enormous amount of work.
They do, and there are some great things going out
paraeducators.
there.
Yeah.
And they don't get the recognition they deserve as frequently as others.
And I feel like a lot of our administrators come from our special ed teachers because they're just incredible. So I thank you. Thank you for what you guys do. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. That is all we have on our agenda, so I will entertain a motion.
I motion that we adjourn.
All right. We don't have to take a vote on that, right?
Well, aye.
Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.